Everybody, I'll call to order the Marin Water Board meeting of June 18th, 2024. Terry, if we could have roll call, please.
Good evening. Director Larry Russell,
Here.
Director Monty Schmidt,
Here.
Director Jed Smith,
Here.
Vice President Matt Sampson,
Here.
and President Ranjiv Kush.
Here.
Thank you.
Moving on to the agenda. Hopefully everyone's had a chance to review, and if so, do we have a motion to adopt today's meeting agenda?
So moved. Second.
Terry, are there any public comments on today's agenda?
Not on the agenda.
Then if we could have roll call vote, please.
Director Russell,
Aye.
Director Schmidt,
Aye.
Director Smith,
Aye.
Vice President Sampson,
Yes.
President Kush.
Aye.
Thank you.
Do we have public comments on items that are not on today's agenda?
Yes, Mr. Phil Sauter.
Good evening. I was looking at a water supply options presentation from 2021, and I came across an overview of some purple pipe options, one of which was supplying recycled water to Peacock Gap. This option would save 166 acre feet of potable water annually, and it had a project cost of $25 million. On a cost per acre foot basis, it was one of the most expensive options, considered at more than $9,000 per acre foot. Just for the heck of it, I converted 166 acre feet annually into gallons per day, as if we were delivering and selling that same amount of water to a residential customer. It came out to 166,000 gallons per day, or 60 million gallons annually, or about 10 million gallons for a bi-monthly billing period. Plugging that into the 2024 online rate calculator, I found that we would have charged a residential customer $408,000 for that amount of water every 2 months, or about $2.5 million a year. I don't know how much we charge Peacock Gap for their 60 million gallons a year. My guess is that the same logic that once led us to discount summer water usage for residential customers might lead us to charge Peacock Gap much less than $2.5 million annually. But just like the summer discount that no longer makes sense, I'm not sure that it would make sense to charge an irrigation rate for potable water that's less than we would charge for the same potable water when customers drink it or wash dishes with it. And if we were to charge Peacock Gap or any other irrigation customer at the same $2.5 million rate we charge for indoor use of potable water, perhaps we can make a case for investing $25 million in a purple pipe system that would significantly increase our price of potable water, our supply, that would significantly increase our supply of potable water for indoor uses where only potable water will do. In addition, converting an irrigation customer from potable water to recycled water would guarantee that customer a reliable water supply, even during times of drought. And that's got to be worth something.
Thank you. We also have Miss Marilyn Price. Go ahead, Miss Price.
Yes, okay. In our last water bill for our household of 4 people, I noticed that our water use went down a bit to 18 gallons per day per person. I've been very frugal in my use of water since our drought in the 70s, and my daughter, son-in-law, and grandson are conscious of their water use too, but not as extreme like me. Still, we only used 18 gallons per day per person. I thought about when I started to be conscious of consumption and what motivated me. Each time I was motivated, it was because I was presented with the big picture. In the 60s, I read in a college class that we would run out of non-renewable resources. Then in the 70s, I read Paul Ehrlich's Population Bomb. Both led me on to the path of conservation. Since that time, I have kept up with our environmental issues and learned much more about why to conserve. But the other week, I watched David Attenborough's 2019 One Planet series and was more convinced of the importance of conservation than ever before. Attenborough's position is that if we take care of nature, nature takes care of us. It is now time for our species to stop simply growing, to establish a life on our planet that is in balance with nature. I'm sharing this long story because I wonder if MMWD shares with its customers the bigger picture of why conservation is important now and into the future. And that if we did, we could convince more residents to save not only because of the drought, but for the sake of our planet. My dream would be that MMWD, a water district in one of the wealthiest counties in the country could develop new messaging that would convince our residents on the importance of conservation and be so successful that we would be a model for other cities to follow, not only for water, one of our most precious resources, but other areas too. I would also like to propose that environmentalists form a citizens group to work with MMWD to make this dream a reality. Thank you.
Thank you. There are no further speakers.
All right. Thanks as always for the public inputs. Jed, do you have a comment? Okay. We'll move on then to directors and general managers announcements. And this time I'm going to get it right. We'll hold off on committee reports to the next agenda item. So starting with directors, Larry.
Yes, I attended the American Water Works meeting last week, and it was quite an interesting meeting, great attendance, and very informative.
Thanks, Larry. Jed? Matt? Okay. Yeah, a couple items from me. First, I also attended the Waterworks Association annual conference with Larry and some of staff, which was an amazing opportunity. And a few things that caught my attention. And Larry, I'm guessing that you and I probably look at very different things when we're there. So I want to see how well these coincide with what you noticed. So two items that really stood out were all the attention around reuse. I think it's not surprising that the new state regulations have unleashed a lot of interest from both water suppliers as well as equipment vendors. But on the water supply side, I noticed two very different perceptions. They're the suppliers that are facing chronic shortages where they really see reuse as an important solution versus those, and I think we're in that category, that face intermittent shortages and still struggle with the practicalities and cost effectiveness. So a lot of discussion from both of those sides. The other issue was the new PFAS regulations from EPA. As you can imagine, vendors are very enthusiastic about this, but the suppliers much less so. In fact, the Friday before the conference started, AWWA and the Association of Metropolitan Water Agencies filed a petition for a judicial review of the PFAS drinking water rule, which created a lot of buzz, at least that I heard during the conference, from people that thought it was a good idea, others that did not. So I think, it's kind of well understood, but still interesting to note how strongly our actions or inactions are really heavily influenced by regulation, right? That's not surprising. Just a couple of things on technology. The technology of the day, at least what I saw, Larry, AMI. A lot of attention around AMI, but really also moving beyond customer water management to emphasizing leak detection through the networks, new technologies for being able to utilize AMI to listen at greater distances to manage leaks. And of course, then, a lot of new analytics that sometimes not so clear what they would get, but a lot of discussion. Now, what I didn't hear a lot of were advances in desal, either with respect to technical improvements or implementation. I was really surprised, very little discussion. And I didn't hear much about efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That was also kind of struck me, but I don't know if you...
I think it's accurate. You wouldn't see desal at this meeting.
Okay.
It's not the thinking of the group. I think the PFAS stuff is very interesting. The standard is set at 4 parts per trillion, which is the level of detection. And it's creating a great amount of pushback in the water industry. So that's what you're hearing there. You got, like you say, you got the vendors like Snoopy on the doghouse, leaning over like the vulture, waiting. But it's an unsettled issue. Okay. I know I've received a lot of phone calls about it, and there's a lot of energy in the business about what to do about it. The other standard you didn't mention, which is also quite heavy, at least in California, is the 10 part per billion hexavalent chrome standard. I'm involved in several litigation matters on this issue right now. And because of chromite, which is the native ore for chrome, we have chromite out of the Sierra Nevadas from volcanoes a long time ago. And the Central Valley from about, I would guess, 100 miles north of Sacramento to at least 100 miles south of Sacramento. There's, in fact, one of the speakers was the guy from the state board who's in charge of setting the standards. And he said of the 500 wells in California that are over the standard of 10, he thought that none of them were industrially polluted, which is the automatic response of a water district. Oh, yeah, it's for industrial pollution. It's just natural background levels, apparently. And that's causing a great deal of consternation as well, because 500 wells, 500 water districts probably, or maybe 300 or something like that. Average cost, as I recall, was something in order of 10 mil to comply. And if you got, 2 wells over and you want to deal with those wells, 10 mil, it's pretty good hit. So there's a lot of confusion right now in what they're going to do. But it's a similar reaction to PFAS. It's different, but very similar. The difference with PFAS is it affects a lot of people. Right. Chrome affects a few. So I don't see a great outpouring coming from the water industry on the chrome standard. They're kind of going, well, it is what it is. Whereas the PFAS, they're going, well, that could affect me. So there's a great deal of scrambling. But I think you're accurate in what you saw. I'm very glad you came. I think I hope you found it to be interesting and fulfilling.
Well worth it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Highly recommend that to anyone else who's considering it. I think one other item, I did make the North Bay Watershed Association meeting on June 7th. And just one presentation that I wanted to touch on which was from a speaker from a consulting firm, the Pacific Policy Group, on the California climate bonds updates. And I feel like this could already be a little out of date, because I think there were some key budget decisions that were due by June 15th that may, reflect on the status of the current bonds. But what we did here is there's an Assembly Bill 1567 and a state Senate Bill 867 that we took a watch on during our May 21st meeting. And these are both around in the $8 to $9 billion range. The water sections in both are about $3 to $4 billion. And they're quite robust, covering, activities from infrastructure to protection of water resources. And the speaker noted that these were going to remain high priorities if the bonds do move forward, because water polls really well with voters. So be great to, maybe, I don't know, Molly, at some point to have an update on what's happened to those as the budget was delivered to the governor. I believe he has to sign it by June 27th, something like that. But anyway, those were I thought that was quite interesting. Okay, I think then we can move on to Ben, any general managers announcements?
I do have one item to share that falls under, not everything goes as planned, but I did want to share this because it's kind of the reality to some extent of the work we do in the district. Last Monday on June 10th, staff was repairing a leak on a hydrant run in Sausalito, and while excavating, staff exposed a PG&E steel gas main, 2-inch main that was encased in controlled density fill, which is kind of a light concrete that sometimes you encase pipes. For example, if it's shallower than you want it to be and you want to protect the pipe from traffic, you may do that. So, but staff had to chip away this concrete, light density concrete, to expose the leak. And in doing so, punctured the gas line. And immediately, of course, contacted emergency services. The fire department responded, and PG&E secured the line and fixed the repair. And, it was an opportunity for staff and for Darren to talk to his staff about the nature of that work and reinforce the practices. So anyway, just wanted to share that it was a spike. It was I guess it would be a near miss, but an important one that I did want to share.
High pressure?
The gas line, I believe it was.
Thanks, Ben. Hopefully it's resolved or has.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, then so now we move on to board committee reports. I'm not sure who's lined up for this week. Okay, yeah.
Sorry, this is kind of the gray area one that fits into the both categories, but on June 7th, I attended the Lagunitas TAC meeting here. And it was nice to have it the second meeting in a row here in our boardroom. And Eric and Jonathan, of course, did a great job with their presentation. And it was really a deep dive into what's going on with the reintroduction of beavers in watersheds and the benefits that go along with them. So it was very informative, and appreciate all the presentations on that.
Great. Thank you, Matt. We'll move on then to our consent calendar, which today includes 5 items. I want to quickly review those. The approval of our minutes from our last board meeting on June 4th, approval of the general manager's report for May 2024, which is included in our meeting packet, approval of a resolution that authorizes an award of contract number 2014 for the 2024 Tiburon pipeline replacement project. This goes to Crocus Construction for in the amount of $2,319,685. Number 4 on the consent calendar is authorization for our general manager to execute the insurance brokerage services second amendment with Alliant Insurance Services for annual brokerage fees of $70,000 for both fiscal years 24-25 and 25-26. The last item is authorization for our general manager to execute the audit services second amendment with Mays and Associates to perform audit services for fiscal years ending in June 30th, 2024. And this is going to be $52,471. It includes both an annual audit as well as a single audit of one major program. And then also the audit that's going to be conducted after June 30th, 2025. The cost for that is $49,371. So those are the 5 items for today's consent calendar. Terry, any public comments on the consent calendar items?
There are none.
Then do we have a motion to approve?
Yep, so moved. Second.
Roll call vote, please, Terry.
Director Russell,
Aye.
Director Schmidt,
Aye.
Director Smith,
Aye.
Vice President Sampson,
Yes.
President Kush.
Aye.
Thank you.
Okay, great. We'll move to our next agenda item, which is a public hearing. And this is related to the adoption of the final initial study and mitigated negative declaration for the Phoenix Bontempi Connection Project and approval of the Phoenix Bontempi Connection Project. So it looks like we have quite a few staff on
Yes.
board for this one.
Yeah, good evening, board members. I'm Alex and I, engineering director. Here this evening presenting this item is Alicia Irish, our engineering manager of planning. Accompanying us today as well as our watershed director, Sean Horn, and Eric Ettlinger, aquatic ecologist, for support. So, Alicia.
Good evening, directors. I have a presentation to share with you. Good evening, directors. Tonight we will be discussing the Phoenix Bontempi Connection Project. Tonight we will go over the current use of Phoenix Lake, discuss the project details, the environmental review process in response to comments received, and finally discuss next steps. Currently, Phoenix Lake is used as part of the district's local water storage supply. In order to use Phoenix Lake water for consumption, district staff transition a portion of the potable water infrastructure to raw water use, and the water is pumped directly from the lake to Bontempi Treatment Plant. Due to the labor-intensive process, and difficulty to directly treat Phoenix Lake water, Phoenix Lake is only used periodically, with the last time being during the 2021 drought. Additionally, this use of infrastructure can only be done during certain times of the year due to the need for the existing potable water infrastructure during fire season. The proposed Phoenix-Bontempi Connection Project is an early action project resulting from the Strategic Water Supply Assessment. This project would install dedicated raw water infrastructure such that Phoenix Lake water is conveyed into Bontempi Lake prior to being treated at Bontempi Treatment Plant. Doing this would improve the operational efficiency of using Phoenix Lake water and allow for more frequent use of this water without the intensive system modifications that are required today. Each pumping of Phoenix Lake over a 28-day period adds approximately 260 acre-feet to the district's water supply. Specifically, this project will install approximately 6,300 feet of new pipeline construction, along with a new pump station adjacent to the existing Phoenix Transfer Pump Station. The figure on the right shows the project broken into sections of work, with Section F, the work in the existing Bontempi Tunnel, proposed to be performed in Phase 1. All other sections are proposed to be performed in Phase 2. Staff initiated work on the environmental review process for this project soon after the project was identified. Staff have been working with ESA to develop the project description and perform initial study assessments, which were done in the fall and winter of 2023. Staff have also been in communications with the regulatory agencies on this project. This project was presented to the Marin Project Coordination Meeting on September 7th, 2023, which regulatory agencies attended. Subsequently, regulatory agencies were invited to a site visit and walk of the project alignment, which took place on November 7th, 2023. In attendance were the Regional Water Quality Control Board and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. The Army Corps of Engineers was invited but was unable to attend. Tribal consultation was also performed as per AB 52 requirements. The draft ISMND was compiled and released for public comment during the period of March 13th through April 12th, 2024, and staff is still working in coordination with the regulatory agencies for needed permits on Phase 2 work. During the public comment period, 2 comments were received, both pertaining to hydrologic and fisheries impacts to Ross Creek, the creek downstream of Phoenix Lake that feeds into Carta Madera Creek. These comments resulted in staff refining the hydrologic study and dialing in the timing of pumping to a more granular level. The resulting operational constraints to pumping resulted in an operational parameter of pumping only from October 1st through February 28th of each year. The first diversion can start on October 1st, and subsequent diversions can begin once Phoenix Lake elevation reaches 170 feet or higher. The hydrologic analysis assessed 2 diversions per year of 260 acre-feet each, with flow limited to 3 million gallons per day or less due to geotechnical constraints. The refined analysis results in the spring flows in Ross Creek closely matching the no diversion or no project scenario. This chart shows the refined modeled results of Phoenix Lake outflow to Ross Creek over the 7-year period analyzed. During the refined analysis, which was an iterative process, staff looked at parameters to closely match the no diversion and proposed project scenarios. The refined result is a very tight correlation between the proposed project and no diversion scenarios, and one has to zero in to find the deviations since it is such a tight fit.
Alicia, this one it's tricky to follow, so I'm just going to interrupt for a minute to make sure I
Thank you.
understand. So there are 3 different lines that are, charted here. One is the flow that we would see, the outflow that we would see in the absence of any diversion, that's shown in blue. And
Correct.
then the outflows that we would see with the proposed project, that's the red dotted line.
Correct.
And in most cases, those are sort of, they're overlapping very,
Exactly.
very well, suggesting that, so that's, you know, that's why you're stating that the impacts on the outflow are not very dramatic. And then of the little boxes show when diversions would take place over this timeline. So I see these little boxes, like these little,
It shows the, oh, excuse me. Um, s- So these boxes here will highlight where we see
no,
some
sorry,
deviation.
Alicia, but if you go to the slide before that, you can see on the, you can see these little, like, almost like little bar, like, yeah, like right there.
Okay. Yeah, so that just shows the start of the diversion
Diversion.
window.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So it was just a little bit tricky for me to follow. So just wanted to clarify. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So there are a couple of areas that we want to highlight that show the slight deviations from the no diversion scenario. In one of the 7 years analyzed, the first peak flow is delayed by 21 days under project conditions. These results indicate that most pulse flows would occur on the same day and with very similar flow rates as under a no diversion scenario. The only situation where peak flows were eliminated under the proposed project conditions was in the winter of 2021, where proposed project conditions would have captured the single event overtopping Phoenix Lake. The refined analysis and highlighted changes show the effects do not rise to the level of significance with respect to fisheries. Overall, there is a tight correlation across the time period analyzed, as is highlighted in 2022 in this figure, where the results of the Phoenix Lake outflow match between the proposed project and no diversion scenarios. This area in 2021 is one of the areas in the original model that led to the refined hydrologic analysis and resulted in the operating parameters and the fit between the proposed project and no project scenarios. In conclusion, based on modeling and analysis, the refined timing and flows will have less than a significant impact on fisheries by avoiding changes during the most critical periods. Staff is looking for board adoption of the final initial study, mitigated negative declaration, and approval of the project, as well as directing staff to file a notice of determination with the Marin County Clerk and State Clearinghouse. Construction of phase 1 of this project is proposed to start in fall 2024. Staff are continuing to work with the regulatory agencies on needed permits for work in phase 2, which is tentatively scheduled for fall 2025. Thank you.
Thank you, Alicia. I think before opening it up, just one more technical question on the data. Now I believe Phoenix Lake the water was pumped up to Bontempi during the 21-22 drought period.
Yes.
So when we're looking at, when we're saying that there are no impacts in the spring of 2022, is that because we had already moved a lot of water, so that what we were seeing in terms of outflows were already, those are already impacted by water,
So pumping was
transfers.
performed in Phoenix Lake during the late winter, early spring of 2021. By this time in 2022, there had already been the winter of 2021 with the large storms.
The large
And
storms.
so I don't believe that the pumping had an effect in the 2022 outflows.
Right. Okay, thank you. So yes, so thanks a lot, Alicia. A lot to cover there. But let's open it up for board discussion. Monty, do you want to kick us off?
I wonder whether before we talk, I would, since it's a public hearing, I would, in some ways, I would rather hear what the public has to say before I comment, if I could hear what the public has to say, who made time to come.
Yeah, good point. I actually had forgotten that this is a public hearing. So, Terry, did we get?
You need to open the hearing.
Okay, sorry. Then we are now officially opened for public hearing.
Yes, we have a couple of speakers. The first one is Ann Thomas.
Oh, hi, Ann Thomas, and I'm speaking for Friends of Corte Madera Creek Watershed. You've had some communication from us, so I'm not going to read them all out loud. Just make a brief statement. We do appreciate the change and the timing of the pumping that you modified, but we find that the final IS mitigated neg deck continues to ignore the impacts of Phoenix Lake and its poor water quality on salmonids in Ross Creek. Ross Creek has a persistent presence of steelhead, which is a federally listed species. Friends requests that you not approve the resolution before you tonight on your agenda, but go back and review how you may be more consistent with your own water policies. And I refer to policy number 9, which I know you're familiar with, that states that protection of water quality is the overriding goal for the management of the Mount Tamalpais watershed. And use this hopefully as an opportunity to improve the conditions for the aquatic life in the creek, Ross Creek and Corte Madera Creek, which are fed by Phoenix Lake. So thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Mr. Ed Jamison. Mr. Jamison?
Wonder how much this project, can you hear me?
Now I can, thank you.
You can? Okay. I have to wonder how much water this project would provide during a drought's reduced flows and what the cost would be for this perhaps minimal additional available water during drought. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Miss Terry Thomas. Apologize.
Good evening, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with you tonight. MCL sent in a letter to you very late today, which we apologize, but we only really became aware of the project on Friday and needed to go through all the documentation. We would urge the board to delay approval of the mitigated neg deck for this project until a bit more thorough analysis could be completed for the biological, hydrologic, and water quality impacts to Ross Creek. And again, we really appreciate Alicia and your whole staff's work on this project. Just seems like it needs a little more definition to us. And it seems like it might be appropriate to just refer it back to the Watershed Committee for more discussion amongst the environmental groups. I'm not going to also go through the letter that we sent in today, but we believe that there could be a way to not only create a need, solve the need for emergency water and more water for human needs, but to also actually improve the habitat to Ross Creek and make it better for the aquatic system and the threatened steelhead there. Seems like most other people said the information that we have, but we just really mainly wanted to see if we could delay it a little longer to have a bit deeper discussion on those topics. Thank you.
Thank you. There are no further speakers.
Okay, yeah, appreciative of those comments and sorry again for not following the
President
proper order.
Gleich, if we can close the public hearing now, since we
Okay.
have no more speakers, that would
Okay,
be
so
a
now
procedural move.
So we are now closing the public hearing, and with this, I assume we can open it up for directors' questions and discussion. Okay. Starting again, Monty.
Okay, sure. First off, I want to thank the staff for the work that has been done to further understand this project. This work reflects Marin Water's continued focus to develop new cost-effective water supplies to increase our resiliency to future droughts. And so it's an important milestone. As with all the investigations the district is undertaking to develop new water supplies, whether it's desal or conservation or new surface storage, these efforts are highlighting both opportunities as well as challenges. And so I think this project is no different in that way. As we've learned more, we have new information that we have to take into consideration. Public comments have rightly, I think, asked questions about the costs and the natural impacts on natural resources, the stream and the fish. I think foremost, understanding the cost per yield is an essential aspect that we need to understand better, because we are committing our funds to projects, and we need to do so wisely to achieve the water supply resiliency that we are seeking and taken into consideration with all the options that we have. So with the new changes with the proposed operation that have been presented here, I think we need to see updated estimates of the yield and the costs before committing to move forward. Another aspect this project has highlighted, though, is the connection between Phoenix Lake and the flows in Ross and Corte Madera creeks. And members of our community and our conservation partners have raised concerns about the impacts this project will have on steelhead and coho salmon. Both are listed species. In review of the analysis, I've got some questions about the impacts of the proposed project will have on reducing flows in Ross and Corte Madera creeks. The analysis that showed that in 2021 that project operations would remove essentially any overtopping of flows from the dam into the stream, and it seems like essentially would eliminate any contributions of flow for that entire winter. And so that concerns me. Similarly, there have been questions raised about temperature impacts, and I don't know if the analysis that have been done to date have really looked at the temperature impacts and other water quality impacts to the downstream flows in Ross Creek and Corte Madera Creek. Fundamentally, Ross and Corte Madera Creeks are considered critical habitat for both coho and steelhead by both state and federal fish agencies. The dam creating Phoenix Lake was constructed in 1905, and since that time, it's been operated without continued releases downstream to support fish. And in the 120 years since, salmon and steelhead populations have plummeted as more dams were built throughout the state, dewatering many rivers and causing many impacts, many of them undesirable. In response to that, and many environmental issues that we have faced, many environmental laws have been passed since the construction of this dam. The Endangered Species Act being obviously most notable, but Fish and Game Code 5937 is another law which was passed, which requires that the owners and operators of a dam release enough water to keep fish in good condition downstream. And this is the law that requires us to release water from Peters Dam at Kent Lake to restore and maintain the health of coho salmon populations. This project that we've got in front of us has highlighted for me something that I was not aware of, and I feel chagrined that I had not ever noticed this, is that we are in many ways treating Ross Creek and Corte Madera Creeks differently than we are treating Lagunitas Creek with respect to the restoration of coho and steelhead habitat and the benefits that a living river provides both ecologically as well as to our communities. So I recognize that this is kind of an inconvenient truth. It would be simpler if we could look at our creeks as simply water supplies and not as habitat or community resources for recreation and other enjoyment. But I think that that the Marin Water, our ethic toward our watershed speaks for itself in our vision, that we are seeking to be leaders in water and natural resource management and addressing the complexities of a changing environment. We no longer operate dams in ways that impact the health of fish and other water quality and habitat issues. So things have changed in time. As such, I think we ought to reconsider this proposed project in the light of the historic impacts that we've had on the health of Ross and Corte Madera Creeks, especially given that the Coastal Conservancy has recently funded a fish passage improvement project, which will increase the frequency and presence of both species in Corte Madera Creek and arguably, if possible, into Ross Creek. Furthermore, I think it's in our financial interest to do so because I've seen time and again how successful the district has been at securing millions in public funding for salmon habitat restoration. I think we have an opportunity to think outside the box here of a traditional water supply project to achieve our mission to provide safe and reliable and affordable water while restoring the health of our creeks and benefiting both fish and people. That's all.
Very thoughtful, Monty. Thank you. Matt?
Monty, appreciate the comments, and start by a thank you to staff for this, a very in-depth process, and also for the public for their for their comments and participation tonight too. And I think this project now is not new on our plate. I think we've seen it for some time. And we reviewed it as part of a near-term solution now, at least for the last 18 months. And looking at it not just as a sole water supply, but an upgrade to our system and a benefit that's going to be able to be used annually. And then we haven't really even touched on potential flood control mitigation efforts too. It's just an additional benefit to it. I was able to read the entire ESA report and pretty thorough document on that. And looking back on the comments we were here tonight, and this is for staff, what areas would need more looking, I guess, or more in-depth research, or where would we go next if we did look at this further, if we were to continue studying this project from the environmental perspective?
Well, thank you for your comment. If we were to look further, we could look at I would say that with the refined hydrologic analysis that we've performed, we've done a very thorough and in-depth job on ensuring that any effect that the proposed project has a less than significant effect on fisheries and wildlife. We recognize that this is both an operational efficiency project as well as an early action water supply project. And we believe that constructing and implementing this project would have not only a benefit for our water supply, but also, as you mentioned, potentially for flood control. And we do not believe that, and we believe that the scope of this project is fairly well defined. And there are some other projects that are related to Phoenix Lake that are identified in our 5-year plan that will allow us to do a more comprehensive look at some of the issues that have been brought up.
Great. Thank you. And that's helpful. I also appreciate the flexibility about taking consideration public concerns and changing the way we would actually draw from the lake through restriction on that. Prior to making that move, were we looking at the same type of minimal impact based on what ESA was saying in terms of hydrological impact?
Prior to the refined analysis, we had a bit of a looser operational parameter in that we were looking to pump in the early fall through the spring timeframe to give us flexibility in operations. And we recognized that with some of the effects that we were seeing from the hydrologic analysis, that it made sense to incorporate these operational parameters to more narrowly define the pumping time window, to incorporate those parameters as part of the project description.
Great. And I'm assuming then it would significantly positively impact the concerns that were addressed by the creek. Great. Appreciate the effort. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you, Matt. Judd?
Yeah, I'd like to hear a little bit more about what you mean by less than significant impact, and maybe hear from Eric and or Sean about what the true impact we think would be. Is it negative at all? And if so, what can we do about better protecting this important watershed, which I get the sense that when there are, less, in drought times, that Ross Creek could have an impact on some of the pools that might not enable certain fishes to come through. And so there should be ways that we have proven that we've been able to do with Lagunitas Creek to significantly benefit our care for the coho salmon and others. So I'd like to hear a little bit more detail about what you guys have done here and why it seems that some of the thoughtful environmental groups don't agree with this proposal.
So I'll start and then we'll hand it to Eric to talk in more detail. It's kind of surprising that we don't have this operational efficiency already built into this reservoir as a management solution. And so this project is really improving that and enhancing something we probably would have done a long time ago if we had the resources to do so. And so as we think about that, We were trying to create flexibility for operations, and that was the original analysis. And so we have ESA, who's been helping us look at the hydrology of it. And when we brought our fisheries group into that collaborative discussion with our engineering group, there was some insight and responsiveness to the letters that we received, that there was an ability to put some controls on the seasonality to protect the life cycle of the fisheries downstream. And so I'll let Eric kind of go into detail about that and how we came to kind of the bookmarks around when we would pump and the rationale for pumping down and allowing a rebound up to that 170 acre foot level. That was a protective measure and a really thoughtful response that came from our fisheries group to help us think about how we could mitigate potential impacts to downstream resources. Anything?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. The initial primary concern that was identified was not so much the volume of water, but the timing and how that would affect flows. So in the steelhead life cycle, the adults migrate up, the young reside in the creek for a year or two, and then they go out to the ocean. And from a biological point of view, delaying the fall flows, the fall initial overtopping was not a significant concern, but there is concern that if you truncate the spring flows, the fish will have a harder time getting out to the ocean. As Alicia said, pumping in the spring was more likely to have an impact on those spring flows. So by having an operational constraint on pumping only through February, it allows the reservoir to fill and spill and have close to or match the natural hydrograph that would allow fish to go to the ocean. So I feel like the revised modeling has really reduced the risk to downstream fisheries when we're talking about migration timing.
Can you go into a little more detail about that? Sorry. So when you say reduced risk, when would that risk be significant? When would that actually have any negative impact at all? When would this change negatively impact those streams?
So one of the difficulties of knowing when a drought starts and when you are pumping water is if the reservoir were to be pumped and then we had an exceptionally dry spring, then Phoenix Lake may not refill and may not then have the opportunity to spill. What's difficult is when you, in a drought scenario like that, creek flows would be low to start with. So it is hard to say the change in hydrology, the change in flows that would impact fish, but yeah, that would be my concern.
And so when you were considering other options, how far did you push it? How far did you try to reduce the takes or look at the timing? And do you think there's more opportunity to mitigate that risk, through further work?
Yeah, so I think that's where ESA's analysis of the hydrograph really comes in, where we were trying to match that, right? And that's where the constraints and the two pumping to those levels was where we were holding that threshold. And so I think we have matched it in the scenario and addressed those concerns around the timing and seasonality.
Are those dates and timing still open for discussion, or are we approving those dates now, or can we approve this project but still give the opportunity to further look at when we will be able to potentially have less risk for the watersheds?
As of right now, those operational parameters are inherent in the project description, which is part of the ISMND. So by adopting the final ISMND, you're adopting those dates.
And there was a comment about the Bontempi water being different than Phoenix that could also potentially impact the creek. Can you talk about that?
Bontempi water, I think that's the mixing of it. So that's not an impact that we're thinking.
Okay, maybe I misheard it. Okay. All right.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on Eric, a question or something we were talking about, which is so in the entire winter of 2021, I think you're describing the very scenario, which is not knowing that we were going into a very dry year. The pumping in advance resulted in the inflow not filling and spilling, and therefore no water being in the creek that year. So I think that's an arguably a significant impact. At least it seems that way to me. But have we also looked at the downstream water temperature impacts of changing the reservoir levels? This was something that was brought up by a letter from Friends of Corte Madera Creek and other water quality constituents. Did we look at those?
I'm not aware of any modeling that's been done to look at, and the impact would be on, leakage through the dam, and that contribution to Ross Creek. And I'm not aware of any modeling or data to really assess that impact.
Larry? I have a couple of comments. Are you sure an MND is the right form for this? EIR? A mitigated negative deck is something that I've seen more like on pipelines replacing pipelines than building a new pipeline. With that said, I have, since I joined the board in 2004, found the practice of repurposing a domestic water line for a raw water pumping facility to be somewhat repugnant. And I'm very much in favor of this project for that reason, because I think it's questionable practice. I mean, we were worried about Pine Mountain Tunnel. Here we're doing it on purpose, shoving raw water into a drinking water line. I think the other thing that's important here is that without this pipeline, we have a problem on using the water. And what we're really talking about here, I believe, and Monty's comments are very accurate and right on, is that this is the classic issue of damming creeks. It's, do you take it for water supply or do you let it go for its natural behavior? And I didn't hear you mention anything about the fact, I recall that we had to lower the level because of dam safety here. I didn't see how that quite fit into it. I think Ed Jamison's comments are very interesting. I presume that lowering of level halves the water or something like that. I don't know what the watershed yield is here, what the max we could take out. The numbers we're talking about, 3 million gallons a day, are pretty modest to begin with, especially when time limited. So it's kind of a complicated, lots of loose ends here. I think the work you've done is admirable. I think it's well put together. I think there are enough issues in my mind with Ann Thomas's comments and others that a delay in moving forward would be justifiable here. I think we are definitely in the measure twice, cut once mode. And while I do see a great benefit to the project from a water supply standpoint, I am sensitive to the project from the other half of that equation. So I don't know exactly what could be gained by the delay necessarily, but I think it's fair to consider it. I'm not talking about a year, but perhaps a month or something like that to try and answer Ann's questions and others to address these. And maybe you felt you've already done all that. I don't know. It's a little hard to read these things and try to ferret out exactly how much interchange has occurred with a few letters and comments. So that's how I see it.
If I can just add on to that, Larry, I thank you for bringing up the balance between water supply in our creeks and water supply for human use. And I think it's a false choice that we can do both. I think we've done that, frankly, with Lagunitas Creek. We've been able to do both, and I think our community is better for it. I think that Ranjiv, you asked the question, what other kind of things could we do to restore the health of the creek? And I think when it comes down to it, when we look at our steelhead and then infrequent, but I think potentially much more frequent coho returning to Corte Madera Creek and Ross Creek as well, that it would be worth looking at what would it take to be able to provide summer rearing habitat for these fish. And having worked on this issue a fair amount on our coastal watersheds, it doesn't take very much water to, to keep one pool to another connected and be able to have survival of steelhead and coho. I think understanding what that opportunity is, what would it take, would be information that would help us make an educated decision about, how can we be better stewards of our land. We have an opportunity here, I think, and we're talking about a water supply project. I still think we will get benefits and yields out of it. I think we actually might have an opportunity to secure public funding because there's such an interest in restoring coho salmon habitat. As we've seen, we've been very successful securing a lot of money in doing that. So I think there's an opportunity to think outside the box here and understand what we really could do here that we can be proud of.
I have a comment. I don't disagree with you. You might have taken my comments different than I meant them. What I was trying to say is this is a perfect example of making the decision. In other words, because the reservoir is so small and you're pumping significant volumes of water out from the 3 MGD is tiny compared to what the impact on the lake is. The impact on the lake is significant. And once you've done it, like the thing about the 21 or whatever it was, that you make the decision to pump it, it's gone. And if it doesn't rain, it's not coming back. So this is kind of like, it's bigger than a tank, but it's like a tank. And you take the water out and you hope that it'll be put back. Maybe it will, maybe it won't, but there's no backing up. That was my point. Not that one is right or wrong. It's just that you need to think about both before you throw everything into the pile. I'll tell a story, which you probably have heard from me before. When I first joined the board, I was out at a meeting in Olema in the Red Barn, and an individual walked up to me and said, you're just like all the rest. And I went, okay. And who are you? I don't know you. And what the person was saying is that we came in and built dams across the creeks and held the water back. And if you, I'm sure, go back to the O'Shaughnessy times and even the Bill Seeger times, that's exactly what was done. The vision of civil engineers like me, water engineers, was you capture the water, it's ours. The fish deal with it as they wish. And that is the result of that kind of thinking is 9517. That's exactly why they instituted Order 9517, because when it first started, they wanted 50% of the water to be released. The water district succeeded in negotiating to 25, but that doesn't mean that 50% wasn't right. That was the assessment. I don't know. I know we have troubles with temperature today. And I'm not enough of a fish person to know if getting enough water is more important than getting water at the right temperature. I have a feeling temperature is a pretty critical issue. And, that's why 9517 is so important, because it covers all of these aspects: the fish, the water supply, how much you can keep, how much you cannot keep. It affects the whole concept potentially of raising dams and trying to capture more water. I was always told 9517 said, if you raise the dams, you have to release that water. We're capped. My understanding is we're capped at the current volume in our reservoirs, not allowed to have any more. If we do, we have to release everything over that. Now, Ben and I have talked a little bit about this, and it's his interpretation, and maybe the foregoing or ongoing interpretation is a little different than that. There's a seasonality piece that I wasn't aware of. For those of you who have read 9517, it's a bit of legal mumbo jumbo combined with engineering mumbo jumbo. So it's like a double whammy. And it's tricky. This whole area is very tricky because it's kind of the root of a water supply draining a watershed, or drawing or utilizing, or however you want to put the words. one thing that hit me from Phil Sauter's comments were, and I don't know the exact numbers, but I'm recalling this is like 25 million too, this project, something in that order.
This project's projected to be about $10 million.
Okay.
And if I may, the cost per acre foot, assuming a 100-year project lifetime, is very comparable even with pumping to our current cost of water today. And I'd also like to point out that Phoenix Lake is different than some of our other lakes, and that the size of its watershed, the volume of water that comes as runoff into Phoenix Lake, is about 10 times greater than the size of the lake, which is very different than some of our other lakes like Bontempi or even Kent Lake. So that means that there is so much more annual runoff that is causing the lake to fill and spill every year, that this proposed pumping scenario allows, with the parameters, such a close match to the no diversion scenario.
And how does the level enter all this, the lowering for the dam?
The lowering of the lake elevation.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's where we have the 260 acre feet. That's it's derived from.
Yeah, that's assumes
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, and that's because at a certain lake elevation, pumping is inadvisable due to the geotechnical constraints. And even such that when you get to a certain lake level, you have to go below 2 MGD to really be conservative for the potential erosion and landslide concerns that may take place with the rapid drawdown.
And an earthfill dam like this, Alicia, it feels this when the level goes up and down. I mean, it's like it gets compressed and then it relaxes. And is there any concern about the kind of working of the dam by having the level go up and down? I mean, I know it goes up and down in nature.
Right. So we did do geotechnical analysis as part of the pre-design of this project. And with our proposed flow rates and our proposed range of lake level pumping, there was no concern from a geotechnical perspective of the integrity of the dam or the lake.
Great clarifications, Alicia. Matt, I think you were. Yeah, just, we've heard comments on water quality specifically, concerns around that, and whether this project may cause further declines in water quality. And I was just wondering what the issues are and whether we have any thoughts on mitigating water quality concerns.
So this project will not exacerbate the existing water quality conditions. Those concerns, I believe, largely stem from the control valve that is the release valve from Phoenix Lake. And we do know that there's a known leakage happening out of that valve. And that valve is in our 5-year plan. I believe it is in fiscal year 26 or 27 to replace that valve, at which time all of those kinds of water quality concerns would be looked at.
Which I've got a flag, which means if we fix that valve, then there'll be no water released to the creek. And I think that, again, we should be mindful of that. Whoever's making those decisions should be aware that, when we have right now, the only water that is in the creek comes from a leaky valve. That's the reality we have today. Is that the way we would like it to be on into the future? I think is a question for the board to provide guidance on.
Ben, did you want to add something on water quality?
Not on water quality specifically, but just to share a thought. In the discussion, it seems to me that there's discussion on creek stewardship, understandably and importantly, that could be distinguished perhaps from the project and the CEQA process. And what I mean by that is, I think what we've shown that with the operating conditions that we put on this project, it's very difficult to distinguish no project and project in terms of the environmental impacts. So one approach could be to think about Ross Creek and Corte Madera Creek going forward in terms of we have such talented fishery staff to partner with Friends of the Creek and think about restoration grants and opportunities, perhaps some supporting of the Fish Passage project that they're going to be working on. And perhaps think about that distinguished from this project itself in kind of a broader view. Just a thought.
Thanks, Ben. Matt, I know you've had.
Yeah, Ben, thank you for bringing that up because I think it's a valid point. We could, bifurcate these two issues, and I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but we already have this capability right now, and we would be doing it the same years that we're in a drought. So we're not looking for anything more than an increased efficiency in our ability to do that. So it's not like this new item or this new operational capacity that we're doing outside of modernizing our current practice.
That's correct. With the stated understanding that doing this project will likely increase the frequency of pumping given the challenges that we have with the current situation.
Right.
One other difference I would point out is that currently we don't have specific time constraints. So we have drawdown geo technical constraints, but we don't have time constraints. Those would be specific to this project if it's approved. So that is a distinction between what we can do now without time constraints,
Right.
although operationally more inefficient versus the project if approved.
So we're putting basically rules on what we're doing as opposed to the practice we currently have now. And going back to that 21 drought, we would have an impact by drawing down the lake, but we do that anyways to get the water for potable use. Okay, thank you. That was it.
I don't know so much it's changing the rules as much as it's changing the tools. Having a permanent available pipeline is very different than what has to happen now. What happens now is they pump off a barge, they go up and physically change the piping. So it's something I wouldn't put it in the Suluhuli level, but it's closer to Suluhuli than it is to normal. In other words, if you have a pipeline there that's dedicated to this purpose with a pump station that's dedicated to the purpose, and you decide you need the water, you can take the water. Now, there are rules that go along with the tools. That's true. But the real factor here is having that ability. That's the difference. This project sets aside I'm trying to think of a good way to describe it. I mean, it's basically a pain in the ass, what we have to do. And therefore, like Suluhuli, you don't do it unless you feel you're really up against the wall. That's the difference. We would be able to do it more frequently. Now, I'll defer to you guys on the fisheries issues and to Ann Thomas and the folks out there. I don't have enough.
With the frequency increase, that's what was mapped out as part of this ESA report, right? So even if we increase the frequency, we're showing that it's not going to be impactful on those years. Okay.
Yeah.
So have you met with the Marin Conservation League and the Friends of Corder Madera Creek and maybe Point Blue and other local leaders about this project and taken their thoughts into account?
We briefly communicated with the Friends of Corder Madera Creek in the fall of 2023, around the time when we presented the project at the Marine Project Coordination Meeting.
Does that mean you communicate? Did you bring them in and talk to them and get their feedback or did you just let them know it's happening? Or
No, I spoke with them.
okay, and the Marin Conservation League and Nona and Terry and other thought leaders in this.
I mean, the project went out for public comment and it went out to everybody as well as the regulatory agencies. We did not hear any public comment during the 30-day window. We have talked with the regulatory agencies several times about this project, in addition to bringing them out to the project site and walking the alignment. We will still be in communications with them for regulatory permits. So they are very much aware that the project is proposed and moving forward.
You mentioned talking with regulatory agencies. Did we talk with NOAA Fisheries?
We put out.
You're on.
Yeah, sorry, I have to sneeze. We talked with many regulatory agencies during the Marin project coordination process. And then during the site visit, we sent out invitations and let folks know that the project was happening. But we did not hear back from all regulatory agencies. So at that point, we moved forward with our communications primarily with the regional board and CDFW.
Okay, so I'm going to take that. I think that there's been, having known folks in that agency, there's been a lot of changeover. So I think whether there was staff paying attention or whatnot, I think that could be an issue, and across all the agencies, which I think are struggling with staffing. But I think they would be another agency that would be worth making the effort to connect with and talk with. And I think, Ben, your idea of how can we look at the opportunities for restoration in the creek, exploring that, seeing what kind of opportunities there are for pursuing grants. I think that makes a lot of sense. I don't think that I would see moving forward separate without at least an initial discussion. I think that it would make sense. And there's also many members of the Lagunitas TAC, I think, who have a lot of knowledge, experience around stream flows and fisheries that would be worth talking to. I think this was even brought up at the Lagunitas TAC meeting and was agendized for their next meeting. Is that true, Eric? Thank you. So that might be another opportunity space to, where a lot of regulatory agencies do attend to, garner some input and some dialogue that could help, I think, identify a really broadly supportable project.
So, I think it's been great discussion, and I actually think that this is really providing an important opportunity for us. So we know that this is a fairly small project with respect to our overall water supply improvement ambitions, but it's critical, right? We have outlined in the next 5 years a series of small steps that together achieve 5,000 to 6,000 acre feet of additional supply. We'll remember when from the strategic water supply assessment, an additional 8,000 acre feet of additional supply would have reduced, the severe emergency we faced in 2021. So each of these is really important. And it's critical that, we find paths forward. Having this in front of us now, I think, provides us an opportunity to establish the procedures, the processes for working with all the different stakeholders that have important inputs to ensure that we're doing things in the best way and with the broadest benefits possible. So I think, I would suggest that we not see this as so much as a tension between competing goals, but more as an opportunity to achieve objectives that we all believe in. Because we share the same objectives. So given that, I think given the great input we've had from board members and the public, I'm going to recommend that we do follow the recommendations to delay the resolution until we've had a chance to have those conversations that, Jed, you just pointed out are important, right? Our stakeholders need to be able to go through the analysis, understand what we can do and what we can't do with respect to better operations management, and get various perspectives from people like Eric, others at NOAA on the impacts that we might be facing with respect to the fish. So, and ideally that builds a process that is going to be something we can apply for the much more controversial things that we're looking at. It's only going to get harder, right? So I feel like if we get this one right, we're really better positioned. I don't know if other board members would support that suggestion that we not move forward with a vote today.
I would. I mean, the question I have, and I don't know that would is the right word there. Should, I think, comes into this. Okay. That's the problem of the heritage of civil engineering that I've been taught. We're taught to get water off of watersheds quickly to avoid flooding. That is if you look at the way the system is set up, that's how it's set up. We're talking about something different here, of holding and releasing. It's a little different concept. So that part, you're right on. And I agree completely. The problem I'm having is I don't know if 30 days makes any difference or not. Are we talking about 60 days? I mean, perhaps you guys already feel you've done all this. I don't know. I mean, I'm sure you would not be here with a public hearing unless you felt you had completed the task.
Right. But Larry, maybe it's not so much, collecting and analyze data. It's discussing what's been learned so that everyone feels equally informed and may be comfortable or not comfortable and pushing for some additional analysis. But it feels like that's a step that could be strengthened.
Where I'm headed is I'm not comfortable indefinitely delaying it. I think we should set a time, like 30 days or 60 days, something reasonable. I don't know what the construction constraints are. I mean, this is in front of all that. If there's something that's really driving it, and maybe we could release phase one, conceivably, as opposed to the whole project, because that's when you said it's inside the tunnel, it needs to be done. And you weren't quite clear when it needs to be done, but something needs to be done in the tunnel.
Larry, I think, out of fairness to staff here, we have a defined process and by law that we're following, and staff has been following that to a T, and they've gone through quite a bit of reporting. I don't feel comfortable delaying it and ask staff with ambiguity on what the direction is. If we actually have something that we would like to see a process, then we should define it and move forward. If not, it's not fair because these folks have been working on this for a year and a half with guidance from the supplemental water supply assessment. So I think we should either vote on it or we should define the next steps on what we would want to do.
I agree. That's what I'm talking about. And like I say, I don't know how you guys feel. Maybe you feel you've already done everything you can do. Maybe you haven't. I think Jed's comments are right on. I think Ann's comments are right on. So we need to take both of them into account. And like I say, I don't know if the window of 30 days makes a difference or 90 days makes a difference. Or does it need to be a year? I don't know.
From what I'm hearing, and the work that's been done, it seems if the board's asking us to engage stakeholders and work with them so they understand the modeling a bit more and that sort of stuff, that's certainly doable, and we could do that. I think we do have a pretty high degree of confidence in what we brought tonight in terms of the impact of the project versus no project, but that is distinct from the opportunity to share that in some detail and have those discussions if the board would like us to do that.
Yeah, go for it. Meet with the Friends of Corte Madera Creek, and maybe if there's NOAA experts that we want to bring in with the Marine Conservation League, have a couple of meetings, sit down, go through it, show them what you've done, get their buy-in. Same as when you're talking about e-bikes, and same as when we're talking every aspect of what we do. Bring the community together, and I think we'll be better for it, and we'll build trust. In general, I think I'm going to be supportive of this project. It makes sense multidimensionally, but it does feel like we have one more step to go. I'm good with 30 days if you guys think you can do it. If you need 60, I just don't want to delay any of the engineering impact of this. So
from timing, I think we can target bringing it back in July.
Okay.
That would be our target.
I would suggest that we're asking feedback from members of the community who are here and then others, but we're also not giving them. We're basically saying whatever conversation we have, we're coming back and we're making a decision in 30 days. I think it's a little bit it's not really a fair process to sort of say we're already determining we're coming back and making a decision, so we're going to meet with you, but we're going to do it anyway. I kind of think out of fairness to having a genuine conversation, I think it's important to have that conversation and see what comes from it and then schedule a decision. And I wonder I don't know whether it's possible. I really do look at the Lagunitas TAC as a really knowledgeable group of people who understand our district and who understand our lands and the hydrology. And the fish in the water supply, and whether there's a way to fast track a meeting of a subset of the Lagunitas TAC, or whether the Lagunitas TAC would be willing to meet sooner than its next scheduled meeting, which I think is in it's in November. Well, that seems a little far off.
Yeah.
So I would be supportive of making it happen sooner than that. But maybe there's a way to, to tap into the TAC members as knowledgeable people. I would certainly trust their engagement.
If I may, just real quick to answer Director Smith's question regarding the constructability, the delay does pose a problem with a window closing. We do have a short window to install that pipe and take the Bontempi treatment plant out of service. So the more delay, it reduces our time frame to procure materials in time to do that project. So I just want to advise the board about that as well.
Yeah, I think we understand that. But again, I think to reiterate, if we can establish a process here that promotes more trust between the different stakeholders, we will, I think, benefit in the long term when we're facing much more difficult issues, much bigger questions. So
is there any way to pair out the portion in the tunnel? You gotta be the whole thing or nothing, huh?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so the portion in the tunnel is a section of the comprehensive project, and what's discussed in the ISM&D is the comprehensive project. So the treatment plant can only be shut down during periods of low demand, and the other sections of the project are constrained for other environmental reasons, the northern spotted owl. So there are tight construction windows inherent in this project, no matter how we parse it out.
Okay, given that answer, which is fine answer, how long do we have if we're going to achieve the next construction window?
Not much. I'm hopeful to get approval today so we could start the procurement on the material to proceed with the project in November to put the pipe in the tunnel. Any delay that prolongs this a lot longer than 30, 60 days really reduces the capability of vendors to provide materials on time, which would cause the project to slip.
And we can't purchase the pipe?
The project has not yet been approved, so we are waiting for project approval to purchase the materials.
From the EIR standpoint or from budget standpoint? It has not been approved.
I would say a CEQA standpoint, but I guess if the materials were materials that could be used elsewhere so that that was, interchangeable, there could be a way, but we have not explored that option specifically.
The size of pipe that we're looking to install for this project is not one that is commonly installed. We're looking to install 18-inch pipe, not only in the preliminary phase 1 section, but also in the other sections. And that's just a size that we don't encounter that often.
Could we put in 24? Is there room to put it in?
We have to explore that because there is an existing pipe in the tunnel.
It does pose a problem with hydraulic capacity of pumping the 3 MGD up. So the size is determined by the pumping capacity. Anything bigger than that would be an issue for the pumps to pump from the Phoenix Transfer Pump Station up.
I'm not talking about pumping more water, but it'd be less head loss. So it's easier on the pumps. If we go to 24 inch instead of 18, because we standardly use 24, I mean, we might even have enough 24 laying around to do this. I don't know offhand. I know there's a lot of pipe out there in the storage.
Yeah, we could look into that with the consultant who's doing the hydraulic analysis, but I'm pretty sure that's been looked at.
Trying to throw you a curveball,
Sure.
Trying to be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
But, that might be a way around this so that we don't pay too much time penalty for the ability to be transparent and to cooperate, get everybody's input. And like I say, maybe you feel you've already done that. You haven't really responded. I've asked that twice and I haven't got any interest back in the answer. I don't know if you feel that or not. I mean, maybe the window was open enough and should have been walked through, but wasn't, or whatever happened. I think, post-COVID is throwing curveballs into a lot of things. And I appreciate Ann's comments that the letter didn't get in until today, which speaks to deadlines and the value of deadlines, that you got to get it in at some point. I don't know what the reason was, because it seems to me this project should have received more interest automatically, but it didn't. So, I don't know where we are exactly, but it seems
Let's go as fast as we can. Right. So let's meet with the folks. I think there's clear feedback. If you can do it in 2 weeks and bring it back in 2 weeks, great. If it takes a month, great, but let's move.
And we need to come back to another public hearing, right?
We do not need to hold another public hearing.
It's done.
We've held our public hearing. We would just re-agendize it. And
Okay.
there could be public comment, of course, but not necessarily a public hearing.
Oh, that's good to know.
Matt, I'm not sure that the one concern that Matt raised is in those discussions, what type of
And that's what I was gonna ask. I guess, we're
guidance are
saying
we
have
providing?
have conversations, but I guess what are we looking for from those conversations? I think it's gonna be important to gain out of this.
And any further changes to help think about how this project might impact the fish population that is of concern as expressed to us by the Friends of Gorda Madera Creek and by Marin Conservation League. And if there are any possible changes that you might have that could be less harmful, and get their feedback and go through in detail your work that you have already done, that it seems like they may not have had a chance to go through with you.
And I would say the same for the fish agencies that are going to may have concern about it. That some of the analysis that we're looking at today is new, and whether they've had a chance to look at it, I would want to make sure that we just check the box, because we don't want to find out later that that's a big issue.
And perhaps with respect to your comments about the leaky valve, I think we should fix the leaky valve, and then make a decision on the staff make a decision on how much the valve should be left open, as opposed to depending on a leak. So, the valve can be left cracked and creating a constant flow, similar to what we do with the Lagunitas Creek issues on the releases.
Sean, it looked like
Worth
you
looking into.
you had a comment on process.
So I'll just note that the analysis that we did with ESA from the fisheries perspective addressed the comments that we received from the community, and we wouldn't expect to be able to mitigate that any further than what's been presented to you this evening. Some of the other questions that aren't part of this project and aren't part of the current project description are being brought up in the subsequent comments in the letters. So one thing to anticipate and expect is that scope creep. You might actually lose the project that we're presenting you tonight. And that's just something to be mindful of in terms of the leaking valve.
Or maybe you're going to have conversations and learn a few things that you don't expect right now.
Well, so where I was going with that was, future phases of management of Phoenix Lake and the stewardship of Phoenix Lake relate to that valve. And maybe those conversations belong there, because that's the issue that you're focusing on, not necessarily the operation efficiency that this project is bringing to you and the modifications to those flow regimes that were presented in those bookended seasonalities. So
We have to empty the reservoir to fix the valve. Yeah. So that's got a window too, huh? Of what's practical.
But Sean, I mean, there's scope creep. There's certainly the potential for that, and everything just starts piling on. We'll do this. We'll do that. We'll do this. But there's also an opportunity to sort of delineate phases of, we may have longer term objectives for fisheries restoration. They're not all going to be addressed in this one project, but we may be able to talk dialogue on how different other objectives could be followed up on down the road and not potentially pushed aside. So even clarifying that may provide some benefit. Well, I think then it feels like we're in general alignment that we would table the resolution for the time being and come back to this in roughly 30 days. And hopefully we're not asking staff for the impossible in terms of setting up meetings. I don't know, Ben, if you have any additional just last minute thoughts on the process.
No, I think we understand the board request, and we can move forward with that, and we'll be doing that and bringing this back in a timely fashion.
Thanks everyone for your understanding. I think this can be frustrating, but I hope it pays off in the long term.
I don't know if it's too late to add this to the watershed committee meeting, which is this Thursday. Is it?
I believe that agenda's been posted.
It has. Okay. All right. That might have been another way to move things forward. Okay.
All right, then we'll move to agenda item 10A, which is our 2024 annual strategic work plan quarterly progress update.
Okay, that is my item tonight. The board has a hard copy in front of you as we go through it for reference. What I'll be doing is going through this a goal at a time. There may be a few slides and then I'll stop and see if there's questions for that specific goal, and I'll keep rolling. I don't think there's surprises to the board, so I'll move quickly. We've also highlighted in red, that's just the areas I'm going to speak to. If there's other areas of interest, of course, we're interested to hear from the board on that. So this first large box is generally around water conservation. And of course, we've been talking with the board quite a bit about that, and a lot of activity going on, as there has always been, and doubling down in a lot of ways. We brought the master plan to the board, as you're aware, and that'll be coming back as we're incorporating the comments. And in the interim, we did modify the incentives programs and sunsetted a couple that were appropriate. Tremendous amount of outreach campaigns that have been going on that are continuing, and we'll be kicking off our high water usage campaign. Water loss, that project's moving forward, and we are planning a board briefing coming up in the next month or so. Did want to note, as we've mentioned to the board, the AMI program manager has been selected and is on board, and is very exciting, and we'll be bringing that to the board as we develop the initial plans moving forward. As you recall, we'll have some pilots associated with it, a lot of excitement that's being generated internally, and the groundwater ordinance will be bringing back as well shortly, as we have talked about. On page 3, wanted to share, of course, we're talking quite a bit about these water supply projects, noting that these two very large, significant efforts, conveyance and design enhancements, have been shortlisted. And we're currently in the 30% design for those, and we'll be bringing those back to the board as we move into decision-making. And also noting the very exciting Nicasio Spillway Modification Project, and we'll be talking about that at the coming Ops Committee meeting on Friday, bringing a recommendation to award a contract. And we'll go into more detail with that. For page 4 and 5, I do not have updates. The next item tonight on recycled water, we will be talking about that in detail in terms of costing. So on page 6, did want to note there's a lot of work that needs to happen in the next 6 months in infrastructure condition assessment. As you know, engineering is staffing up to meet all this work. Did want to share the above ground hardening. There was a board request for that particular one to accelerate, and we have done that. We've inspected 47 out of 97 pump stations, and we're bringing that back, the findings, as we complete that effort. On page 8, that's just noting a lot of the CIP is based on resourcing, and we've brought to the board some reallocation of staffing positions, and we'll be bringing back some targeted additional staffing, as we have mentioned to the board. On page 9, to me, this is very exciting, and I appreciate the leadership and operations embracing a number of these issues, including taking a look at a range of standard operating procedures with new staff and refreshing them and identifying some that we didn't have. Also, tremendous amount of energy on BNC going out to all these different agencies to learn from them, developing connections, bringing in vendors to talk about new tools, new equipment. And it's really being embraced by staff as I'm talking to staff. So it's really nice to see. On page 11, over the next 6 months, we'll be talking to the board quite a bit about emergency response preparedness and readiness. Did want to note that the dam emergency action plans that have to be updated on an annual basis, that has been done, and they're currently with Cal OES for review. On page 12, you're very aware the great work that's going on in the grant funding with Lagunitas Creek. Always want to call that out because it really is such a highlight of who we are and the work we do and the recognition that we get from that. On slide 13, again, so much work going on. Much of it is Q3 and 4, but did want to note two very important items. Again, this year, we were able to get a grant for a CCMB crew as well as Grizzly Corps Fellows that helps move forward a number of the work in the watershed, including the BIFA support for rangers and volunteer programs. So it's just continued success really with the watershed team, really small but mighty, and augmenting their resources with outside resources, largely grant funded. Great work. On slide 14, again, a lot of work we'll be talking about going forward, but noting that the board did approve the one-TAM MOA. The slide 15, recreation in the watershed. We've talked about a lot. Of course, the upcoming watershed committee will be talking about it again. The program framework for the recreation plan. Azalea Hills is moving forward, and we've developed a self-guided tour, and we're developing a couple of these. We did one this past year, and it was supported by the community and appreciated, so we're developing a couple additional ones. On page 14, noting the connection fee study. We do have a consultant selected, and we're in the data collection process. So very soon we'll be coming to the board as we frame that effort and get feedback from the board on some of the aspects, how you'd like to see it roll out and be developed. Also noting that we did in Q1 complete the credit rating review, and we're upgraded to AA. So that's quite impressive for this organization, and obviously will pay dividends when we find bonding needs for the district.
I thought we were at AA. weren't we?
You know, it's interesting you say that, because this says upgraded. I thought we were as well. Were we AA minus and we're AA? That may be it.
We were previously, sorry, Brett Upnall, Finance Director. We were previously AA with outlook stable, and now we're AA outlook positive. So it's just kind of a upward arrow on the AA. Thanks.
On slide 20, state and federal grants, 10 million for a range of projects. So continue to have success with that, and a number of grants, as you're aware of, in the queue, grant applications. On slide 21, we've developed a number of a lot of work going on. The customer online tool that was, I think, presented to the board is really a great advancement of really helping folks on how they can save water and save money and see that nexus there. And now we are posting, there was a request, the quarterly financial statement, and that, of course, was done. On slide 20, a lot of work in different ways, of course, recruitment, and we've been updating the board, a lot of activity. And we've developed new tools to enhance our reach in terms of recruitment, which is increasingly important. We're finding, as many similar agencies are starting to tighten up a bit, particularly in the technical realm to get staff. We're increased where we post for that. We've enhanced our onboarding process, which has been great. And we've actually brought on our new training program that the board supported in its last budget. So she just started, I believe, in the last week or so and is developing kind of a 5-year training program that we'll be sharing with the board our thoughts on how we roll that out.
What is the status of the $28 million earmark?
Yeah, so that's the WRDA earmark. And this year, it might have been the bridge back east. We were notified that there's not the funding that there typically is. So we are working on kind of another approach to tap those dollars. And but yeah, it's
I wonder
quite
if
a
they'll
process.
put that money back after the insurance company pays.
Right.
Kind of interesting.
Right. On slide 23, this is, one of our touches on our key initiatives as we're updating our employee recognition program, internal communication strategy, employee engagement, organizational improvement. As you're aware, we have formed a committee work group to talk about these issues. It's really a broad-based group with a lot of energy and excitement, and I always look forward to those meetings. We've had a couple. We have another one coming up. At the last meeting, for example, Adrian came and just engaged the group on internal communications, which I think is illustrative of going forward. How do we want to use this staff to drive kind of a grassroots approach to, and really it was great feedback, a great discussion, and we'll be doing our first employee newsletter coming up, and we'll go back to the group. And so all these different initiatives will be brought to the group, discussed, and just build on the energy of this group that is so engaged. Very exciting. And safety, I highlighted because it's always important. We have a new safety manager. We have, I believe, a very good safety program, but we want to have a great safety program, and that's the track we're on. Page 24. We published our efficiency estimator calculator that, again, will help folks, another tool. And professional development on the last page, we've given a couple presentations in the last 6 months. We have an abstract that just got accepted for an upcoming conference in September on dam safety. And we're continuing to look for opportunities, right? And this is all about getting out of our silo and just having a presence in the industry, developing those connections, and really feeling the richness of the industry beyond our job. So that's the update. I was going to stop at every goal. I guess I got on the roll. So if the board has any questions or comments, love to hear them now.
Thank you, Ben. Yeah, let's open it up for director's discussion. Jed, do you want to?
No, I just super appreciate you guys bringing this back, updating us. First of all, doing the strategic plan in the first place, and then reporting out. So, no more comments. Thank you.
I don't know, Ranjiv, if you had the opportunity to look at the TAP contest. Okay. Well, I am good. You did. Yeah. It's interesting. It's a cross between Indianapolis Pit Crews and Killer Tigers. It becomes extremely competitive, especially certain water districts. And they're not necessarily like New York and LA. I mean, it's like Louisville and people like that, unusual ones that have taken it very serious, but I'm extremely happy to see it back in here. You talk about regional here. I mean, the next AWWA is in Denver. It's not very far. Time-wise, it's not very far, and its distance not very far.
You gotta.
I know.
Yeah.
Oh, is that right? Oh, I didn't realize you had to compete. I thought you could just say you wanted to go. Oh, I see. So
One state from California, one team goes to the AWWA.
Oh, good. Well, that's interesting. I didn't know that. But I'm glad to see the interest. And you mentioned our position in the industry, which is important, but I think even more important is that folks who work in the field don't have a lot of opportunity to go to things like national conventions or even regional conventions. And so this gives them an opportunity on a different path, not the professional, give the paper path, or even just the PR path that most of us are on. But the other side, I think I can't be more excited, very frankly. And thank you very much for doing that.
Yeah, great to learn. Now I'm really sorry I missed out. I should have been paying attention. Matt?
Yeah, just piling on the thanks and appreciation for the work that goes in to get this progress done. So thank you.
Monty?
Yeah, I'll just say ditto. This is really a great update. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Look forward to the following updates as well. Terry, any public comments?
There are none.
Okay, then we'll move on to item 10B, which is the review of desalination and recycled water costs. Welcome, Paul.
Good evening. Thank you. Just another light topic for our evening. Let me see if I can pull up the presentation. Wait, where did it go? Great. Technology hasn't failed me yet. Good evening, Paul Sellier, Water Resources Director. So tonight, just sort of briefly, we're following on from our discussion that we had at the May 23rd Finance Committee, where our Finance Director kind of walked us through the water efficiency model, looking at it as a water supply. So tonight we're adding two more of our big projects, if you like, to that category and looking at them and trying to understand sort of this notion of what President Kirsch started out the evening commenting on. We're in a little bit different position in terms of drought, of need of water. Our need is this intermittent need as opposed to this kind of present and ongoing need. And how do we think about the value of water and how do we want to talk about it? So there's a little bit of that tonight. And Director Russell's comments about the double whammy of, I think it was engineering and legalese. So we'll try to stay out of finance and engineering because those two are disastrous when they're put together sometimes.
I recommend, if you haven't already done it, to take a look at David LaFrance's op-ed in the AWWA journal this month. It's the last page of the journal, and it's titled "The Value of Water versus Its Cost."
Right.
And it's a detailed review of cost of service analysis versus pricing water on its value. It's quite interesting.
Yeah, it's a tricky subject, and I know there's a lot of discussion on that. So for tonight, anyway, I'll try to be brief as I can. So just a quick overview. We'll touch on some exciting work that we know that when we've touched on some of them this evening, those sort of short-term roadmap projects. And then get into a little bit of the math and somewhat of the discussion and philosophy about what we're thinking about in terms of cost. And we'll hit desalination, recycled water, and we'll get you guys out of here at a decent time. Okay. So this is sort of a snapshot of the short-term action projects that we're taking a look at in terms of the roadmap. You'll see water efficiency is at the top there, and we've talked to the board about Sulhuli, the electrification of the pump station, and some of that we talked about even this evening, and the pipeline to Nicasio. And of course, the big focus of tonight was the Phoenix to Bontempi. So we'll be back at you, and maybe these numbers will change a little bit, but nonetheless, we're a stubborn bunch at staff level, so we can take it. So thanks for the good discussion on that this evening. And then stream release automation, that's underway. We're kind of in testing, and some of these projects perform differently depending on the different type of hydrology you experience that year. If the rain, for example, for stream releases happens just at the right time, then we don't have to release anything, and it's great. but our automation project really wouldn't help us much in that respect. In dry weather, maybe it's different, right? So there can be different performances in different types of years. And then last, but certainly not least, represented here is the Nicasio spillway modification. And of all of these, this is kind of exciting. And I was sort of sitting down just thinking about, wow, we've just been talking about these forever, and it does feel like that. So when are these going to be in service? And right now, it looks like sometime in the next between 6 and 24 months, we're going to start to see some of these dominoes hopefully fall into place. So stay tuned and hang on to your hats. I guess we're in for a fun ride for sure. So the take home here is these projects are going to deliver somewhere around 4,000 to 6,000 acre feet of water in the next 24 months. Okay, so how do we think about water supply projects and this apples to apples comparison? How do we do this? I mean, first, a project horizon. What sort of time period do we want to compare projects? We know, we heard today, the Phoenix to Bontempi is mostly a pipeline. It could be 100 years. That's your average expectancy for a pipeline. On the other hand, a desal plant might be 25 years. So how do we want to think about those? And how would you try to characterize something like water efficiency over 100 years to try to bring them to an equivalent basis? So there can be some challenges there. So these comparisons aren't going to be perfect, but we're going to be consistent among them. Yield is challenging, right? Not for the projects themselves. We can tell you, obviously, a 5 million gallon a day desal plant is 5,601 acre feet a year. That we know. But in terms of drought, how do we want to think about yield of these projects? If we're only going to use a plant for over 4 years over the 25-year project horizon, that yields very different than 5,600 acre feet every year. So, which is sort of the traditional approach. So we're striving today to kind of develop this method where it represents the sort of value of water in the context of drought for us. And we want to understand these same assumptions that we used with water efficiency. So just quickly reminding us, water efficiency, right? This was sort of where we ended up. We used this method Brett presented where we're estimating the cost of the program over that project horizon. In that case, it was 20 years. We'll see later this evening, we've extended that out to 25 years for the comparison. And yield, again, was based just on when we needed the water. And I'm going to keep coming back to yield. It's going to be a key differentiator between sort of these traditional approaches to cost and the way we're looking at it. Okay, so again, planning horizon, classically sort of the useful life of a project. And it's only when you get into comparing different projects with different useful lives that you need to come up with a common planning horizon. And there are different tricks and ways to do that, and we'll get into those as that becomes appropriate. Project cost, typically, in engineering land, we'll refer to that as the capital cost. It's basically the money you need to construct the project today. Operating maintenance costs sounds pretty normal. It's the money that you need to operate the facility over that lifespan once it's completed. And again, yield, the way we're going to be thinking about it in the alternate approach is the volume of water that we would expect to be utilized in a drought. And then in the alternate approach, we're doing a little tweak from the traditional, and we're using present value as opposed to just the straight amortized capital cost. And
are you going to attempt to put its value when the yield is needed? In other words, obviously the water is worth more when you need it.
Yeah, you can't eat. Well, that would be a tough one, wouldn't it?
It would, but it's indicative of the value of the project.
And you'll see a little bit of that here with these numbers in this sort of alternate approach that we're presenting are very different than what we're used to seeing when we talk about just normal traditional approach to capital. So everything you'll see in the alternate approach is present value, and for lay folks, that's just a way of thinking about a future cost in today's dollars.
Yeah, put into different words, interest and inflation are tied together. So when people talk about the difference in cost in the future, it's actually not that different because the present value is just adjusting for inflation interest, whatever you want to call it, the value of the money. So it's kind of, it's true. The numbers change, but the value doesn't change. The value is pretty much fixed, and the dollars decrease in value, but the value doesn't change.
As you say, the value in a drought is the old Visa priceless, right? So, okay, so we're looking at defining this as a unit cost, right? So we've got a numerator and a denominator, and the dollars is our numerator, and they're fairly straightforward. We know how to do that. And then in the case of the denominator, that's our yield, and that's where we're going to keep coming back to. In the traditional approach, which works well, right? If we have this present need for water and we're going to use all of that recycled water facility, we have a need for that water, and those approaches to developing a unit cost will work well. In those cases, an annual cost is basically an amortized capital cost along with the O&M. You add those two up, and the yield is just the capacity of the project. You divide the two and you've got your unit cost. Under our alternative approach, this is where we're using cumulative cost over the whole planning horizon, which includes the same capital and O&M, but now expressed in present value. And yield is the water that we use only in drought. And just sort of, maybe I'm hammering this too hard, but I'm going to go after it one last time here. So why do we want to think about only in drought? Well, our reservoirs spill. Most years, it turns out, if you look at this chart, the green represents sort of the maximum reservoir value level in the year, and the blue is the minimum. So we can see that over this 20-year period, 24-year period or so, there are a handful of occasions when we would be counting actual yield. That's not to say, if we look at the blue, that we wouldn't be really happy that we had an alternate supply, and we might be reaching for that switch. But at the end of the year, when we go back and look at, was this really a necessary thing? We might not count that as yield, but we'd be very happy for it. Okay, so quickly, desalination and review. This is the strategic water supply assessment projects of 5, 10, and 15 MGD capacity plants. And the costs for those have been informed by the pilot program that the district ran in around 2006. We took about a year, studied different technologies, and got some pretty decent information on our local water quality and what it would take to make a desal plant go. So we take the traditional approach. You could pick any of these. Let's just go with the middle columns tonight because there's so many numbers on the page. 10 MGD plant, you're looking at a project cost of $331 million, thereabouts. O&M of about 22 million and an annual capital of 18.5. So we're going to add our O&M and our annual capital, and then we're going to divide by the annual capacity of the plant, 11,201. We get about $3,600 an acre foot. And that sounds wonderful, except for the fact that we know, based on all the yield that I've been hammering along, our reservoirs are going to be spilling. So we'll be operating this plant in years when we don't really need to. So again, it's helpful. This does show, for example, that based on scale, you're going to achieve different economies for the unit cost of water. And we do see that in the industry. There's a curve, right? The bigger the capacity of the plant, the less the unit cost of water. And I'm sure there's some minimum that it achieves, but the biggest plant I know of is the Poseidon desal plant down in Carlsbad, California, and they're cranking out water at about $2,800 an acre foot, something in that region. It may have gone up a little bit, like everything else has.
You might mention, to remind the board, what our current acre foot cost is.
So our current acre foot cost for Sonoma water, for example, is on the order of $1,600 an acre foot today. So Carlsbad's at 2,800, and that's a 50 MGD plant. So it'll be out there on the cost curve. I don't know that it gets a whole lot cheaper than that. Okay, so in our alternate approach, we've got the similar planning horizon, 25 years. We're going to calculate our O&M costs across this period and express that as present value. And then key here, right, we're going to assume a water yield for the project during the planning horizon. And our assumption is a 4-year drought over that 25-year period. And this kind of ties us back to the strategic water supply assessment, which, if you recall, we used this 4-year drought In that case, it was very specific in terms of the intensity of the drought, and we picked 76, 77, followed by 2020 and 2021, if you want to know the actual hydrologies. In this case, we're just going to assume, because this is a comparative analysis, that we're going to use all of the capacities that we're talking about here. So it's sort of independent of how severe that drought is. We're just assuming it's severe enough that we're going to use these capacities. So then the yield for these projects is only counted in drought years, and we're just assuming it's the full capacity. So 5 MGD desal plant, we're going to use all of that capacity across the year and the full 5,600 acre feet. So that just again, if I haven't hit it enough, yield is the main differentiators here. Okay, picking on the middle column again, this is a 10 MGD desal plant. And what you see is the present value. So that's the value of the O&M, the annualized capital across the whole 25-year planning period and brought into present value terms. And then in year 1 of the drought, we're dividing by the capacity of that plant. In year 2 of the drought, you've benefited twice from that capacity. So, and we add a little bit of cost to produce that water as we go through. So we've tried to represent these costs as favorably in one way as we can, in that we're not assuming we're maxing out this capacity over the 25 years. In fact, we're assuming we're operating at 25%, except in those 4 years. And that's what's represented here. I would add that in the Jacobs report, they had a low and a high cost for water. The difference on this table is at the 4-year level is about $500. So it goes from 9,500 to 10,000 at the 15 MGD end of things. So they're very comparable at this point. Okay, so then just thinking about desal, just to remind ourselves some of the considerations, it's reliable in a drought, right? The ocean's not going anywhere. Maybe it's one of the most reliable. But it is vulnerable, right? You do get red tides. There are going to be algae events. There could be some oil spill in the bay. So nothing's perfect. And in the sort of column of not perfect are these high O&M costs. You saw they were even higher than some of the capital burden, capital annual costs.
Although you could do an intake in the ocean and avoid all of the bay issues.
Potentially, yeah, with additional costs. With desal too, remember we talk about different project horizons, pipelines, 100 years, I don't know, a dam, 200 years. So some of these projects, if we want to try to extend them out to 100 years, we're going to need to replace these facilities. Even pump stations on a pipeline, we would need to replace over 100 years. So in desal, there's a high cost of this sort of cyclic replacement or renewal of facilities. And again, just noting that the plant, we're operating at continuously, even in wet and rainy years. Although at reduced capacities, we're still having to operate it in order to make sure it's ready for us to go. And then last but not least, we have the burden of a public vote should we wish to pursue a desal plant.
Are you going to expand this to DPR?
Coming on a slide to you shortly. So this was the SWUSA look at recycled water, right? Or this was our last look. I think Lucy presented to the board sort of a summary of recycled water. So these are some of the key projects, and this is sort of what we're talking about here. And you just see DPR is represented on this slide at the bottom there. Under our traditional approach, which is again, planning horizon 25 years, and some of these projects, I think we'll see some adjustments as we go through, bring in other projects. I'm not happy with the Peacock Gap representation here. That's mostly a pipeline. So it's now suffering a little bit from a 25-year life. We need to make sure that's given its 100-year life to bring those numbers into real comparisons. So it's not perfect, but this is our cut at it here in terms of what these projects would look like in the traditional approach. So, and you can see the range in acre feet here.
And 100 years might be low. I mean, if it's a pipeline, we put in a PVC pipeline, it's probably.
Yeah, we just take that as kind of a minimum expected life. And yeah. So all of the same kind of caveats about the traditional approach still hold here, right? Because our reservoirs still fill and spill, even though recycled water, it's another way of preserving potable water. So if for example, we spilled 81 feet and we built SASM, we'd be going, darn, we shouldn't have built SASM that year, right? That kind of a thing. Okay, so, and then our alternate approach, just kind of rehashing some of this. I won't go over all of it, but I will put the red box up over the yield, just highlighting that again. And then when we hit those numbers, you can see, SASM, for example, at the 4-year drought here is 18,700, and previously it was in the 4,300 range, something like that. So we're talking about value of water. That's what kind of these numbers represent for us, assuming, 1 to 4-year drought. So that's how we're thinking about it. It's different than how the industry thinks about water supply projects. It's more the traditional approach, and you just go, well, this one's cheaper than that one. And this generally holds true in this type of analysis too, but this gives you, I think, a clearer picture of what the value of that water is to us for these intermittent drought needs. So as we think about, recycled water and potable reuse considerations, again, high reliability in a range of drought conditions. I would say IPR, the regional IPR that's pulling in water from all the wastewater plants to a central location, it's adding a lot of infrastructure in addition to a complex treatment plant. So that one, I think, has some challenges, and I'm not sure any particular advantages of that over something like DPR. And DPR, we know it's fairly new, talked about this earlier in the evening as well. So the punchline, as we start to look at these projects side by side, and you can see kind of where we're going with this in the future is we're going to be bringing in conveyance and teeing that up in a column next to these, and storage and teeing those up in a column next to these. And I can already see everyone sort of going, wow, Paul, you did a great job. You bought us $65,000 an acre foot water. But again, these are just relative comparisons. It is our alternate approach to looking at it instead of a true cost way for us if it's a drought supply.
And again, remember the value versus the cost.
Yeah. And so here you can see a large desalination plant maybe has the best unit cost, but we're not going to be done here. And we did talk, right, if you recall earlier in the evening about Nicasio, and it's kind of interesting to see where that falls on this type of a chart. So when we add in Nicasio, it's pretty close to the current cost of Sonoma water. And that assumes, right, that Nicasio is a $5 million project, and we're not entirely sure where that capital is going to land, but that seems like a reasonable assessment for the Nicasio spillway. So it's pretty exciting to see that we have a real viable option that is this is a drought water supply cost for Nicasio. So it's on the same basis as these other projects. So there are options out there. And you'll note when we were to look at a table for Nicasio, it's not going to have this burden of O&M cost. And it's going to have a very long life, right? It's a project that's going to last a fairly long time. So exciting, and hopefully complete 16 to 24 months. Okay, so unit costs, they're important. They give us a nice relative view of how these projects look. Getting a real cost of water would kind of require us to have that crystal ball. We would need to know, when's the drought coming? How severe is it going to be? How much are we going to spill certain years, not others? And we're not going to be able to come up with that. We can get really creative with different ways of doing it and come up with probabilities and percentages. But in the end, for comparative purposes, a simple estimation of yield in the way that we've talked about tonight is going to maybe be most helpful for us going forward. So then other things we need to be thinking about as we look at these water supply projects, how do these perform in a drought? Is kind of important. If you're thinking about buying insurance coverage, you want to make sure you buy the best, cheapest insurance coverage, but from a firm that's going to pay.
That may be an oxymoron, but
it probably is. But and so anyway, our next steps then are to develop those costs for conveyance and storage, stack them up next to it, and then have another conversation with the board on it. That's what I had to share this evening.
Thank you, Paul. A lot of big numbers. Let's open it up for board discussion. Matt, do you want to start us off?
Paul, thanks for taking a different perspective on the approach for this and breaking it down in terms of when we'd actually use the water, bringing in the actual years we spilled into the equation, because I think it is important, especially seeing it for a second time now and letting it sink in and actually taking a look at it. I'm really excited to see what the larger storage projects as well as the conveyance projects are going to be stacked up. And if we can continue that same type of graph through this, it will be very helpful for comparisons. But thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Jed?
Thanks again for bringing this, and Monty, I think you were taking the lead to make sure this is part of our regular agenda. So I really appreciate you continuing the work. I think I'm getting a little analysis fatigue, and I'm kind of ready to make the call and move here. I think our community's ready for it. I'm ready for it. And you've been doing this for 20 years. I bet you're ready for this. So let's lock arms, make the call, and find a way to get some strong, long-term, lasting resiliency for water and for the impact of climate change and drought, and bring it to us with 10, 15,000 acre feet. Let's get one of these going and move forward.
Thanks, Jed. Monty?
I mean, this is I appreciate the desire to not have analysis paralysis and go and study and study and study. These are really big, important investments. So I want to make sure that we bear down and bear through the analysis paralysis to actually make a good decision. So, but let's do it in an expeditious way, because that's what we've committed to do. I have to say that the graphic, if you want to put it back up, Paul, it has all the different options. I know that at a previous meeting, we looked at a new way of looking at the cost of conservation. And I got to say that I can't really, the number that we have up here, or Paul will have up at some point here. It's
I'm not sure about that.
North of, Matt's got it right here. It's north of it's $12,100 per acre foot. That is so wildly above and beyond what is reported by so many other urban water agencies. And I know that we were trying to take an approach of looking at it differently, that was trying to look at the full cycle of costs and other things. I just think that when we come up with a number that is basically 10 times what we see elsewhere in other water districts, I think we have to really think twice before we make decisions around a number of that type. And so, and conservation is really extremely important. We've made that point very clear through the board over all the years I've been on the board, and I'm sure for years leading up. I would just like us to, if we're going to keep using this methodology that has been employed here, I would really like us to have that peer reviewed if we're going to be making decisions around it, because it is just so wildly different than what we see in other estimations of conservation costs.
If I could, the numbers of conservation, even when staff was looking at them, we were quite surprised what those numbers were. And by showing them, we aren't suggesting in any way like a value of conservation, right? This is strictly and narrowly trying to look at, in context of drought, to help the board think about where do we invest limited dollars to achieve, strictly in context of this discussion, supplemental supply and resiliency, not in any way suggesting that conservation doesn't have so much value and benefits beyond this narrow look in this context. So I mean, staff, we're all in conservation, and regardless of the number, there's no indication from the board or staff or the public that we would cease our interest and passion in pursuing conservation. I want to assure the board, it's really just a very narrow look at water supply in context of a drought.
I appreciate that, Ben. I don't think, I'm not proposing that we need to look at this because we are going to put blinders on and just do it because we're committed to do it and we said we would do it. I think we make a decision based on what is the most cost-effective means of delivering water supply. But at the point I'm making is that that number is so dramatically higher than industry standards that I'm a firm believer in making decisions with good information. That number is just so dramatically high that I feel like if we're going to be using a different methodology than the industry standard to compare these things, because I think everything else we're doing in many ways is much more known. A lot of the engineering and design is a much more known factor than the social factors that go around conservation and efficiency. So that's where I feel like if we're going to use these, use a methodology to really try to get a handle on that, then let's make sure that we're really getting some outside peer review from other experts about that number and process so that we can have the right number to make a good decision around.
Larry?
Well, my friends, fasten your seatbelts. This is where we're going. And you're exactly right, Monty. You react to the numbers as being high. I react to them to being reality. And we're facing what industry faces all the time versus the public sector. And that is very simple. Industry wants to reduce capital expenditure and maximize O&M cost because they write that off as they go forward. Municipalities want to maximize capital input because they get it cheap and reduce operating costs. So that's what you're seeing here. It's kind of hidden in the bushes right now, but it's shocking to me that the numbers are actually low compared to the numbers of the reservoir expansions. You know, I still haven't got over those numbers. 290 million being the low number, 610 and 620, which follows the municipal model. A lot of money in upfront to reduce long-term capital cost. Of course, the annualized cost of the water is going to be lower if you have no cost of the water except for building the structure to hold it. Forgetting about the legal and fish impacts and all that stuff. So this is tricky stuff. And, you know, I credit you, Paul, to respond to our input, and I appreciate what you're trying to do here. It's very interesting. There's probably one more piece of the pie that needs to be done, which is somehow to put in the value. You know, your analogy to insurance is exactly correct. What is the value of having it in your back pocket when you need it? How much does that detract from these numbers, subtract from the numbers? If you don't have it, what happens then? At the AWDA meeting, I was, because it's right next to Disneyland, the convention center, I was talking to an Australian who was not in the water business, but was very curious about why we were there. And I said, in Australia, what happened was 9 years in a row, they said, it's going to rain. It's going to rain. It's going to rain. And they postponed the decision to put in desal. Then they said, uh-oh, I guess it's not going to rain. So they then went and bought everything available in prefab desal. And they put the like 9 plants in or something like that. And of course, you know the rest of the story. It rained. Yeah. And if you look at Goleta in Santa Barbara, it's the same exact thing. They put the money in. By the time they got it done, and Ranjiv made a very important observation in, I think it was the last meeting, that conservation is the only thing we can do now and at a relatively low cost. I do appreciate your comments on social side of it. And I don't know the answer. And I don't think anybody in the water business knows. More can be done. What more? I'm not so sure. You know, I mean, as Phil Sauter has said, the easy side of this business is get rid of grass. Grass is an ancient thing that should not be around in a Mediterranean climate like ours. As I've said, go to Greece, go to Italy, see how much grass you see. England, France, you see grass because it rains all the time. The lower Mediterranean, you don't see any grass. And, you know, that one is pretty easy if you think about it conceptually to reduce demand, just get rid of the grass. However, we have to do that. The rest is more complicated. You know, if you're not willing to go full blown gray water on-site recycling, then your hands are pretty much tied. You know, people will only limit so many showers. Now, they can do more if they have to. They don't want to live like that. So there's a quality of life factor here that we're sort of hooked to a certain, I don't know what that number is. It's 35 gallons per person per day or 52 or whatever the state thinks it is. But you get below that number and people get discomforted. And you always have the problem of the drought, which is pay more for less water. That is always going to bite us. We raise our rates during droughts because we run out of money. And as I mentioned to Ben the other day, I had a brief conversation with Grant Davis, and Sonoma is testing the water to find out what level of fixed fee they can attach to their current costs because they're getting killed with this 25% reduction in water supply. And their costs haven't gone down 25%, but their income has. And so that's a reflection on all this. And when you raise that fixed portion, it's anti-conservation because you go, well, I'm already paying 49% of my water bill. You know, what difference does it make if I conserve or I don't? It's a very tricky area to implement into the public. And it's hard to get them to figure out what the value of the water is.
It sounds like we're going into the next water efficiency committee meeting. But yeah, totally agree, Larry. I just want a couple of quick things. Paul, I find this yield-based calculation of benefit super interesting. I think you and Brett have provided a very, innovative alternative view on how we should be thinking about costs. But I think that, I agree with Monty that running this, because I don't know the degree to which this type of methodology is applied. Running it by, water economists just to say, hey, this is the method that we are applying to help us make big, important decisions. What do you think of this? I do think that reassurance is helpful. I hope there's opportunity to present on this approach at
there is
meetings.
There is. You should be thinking that way. And that's how you set the industry standard. You ask if we're doing industry standards. The way it changes is by you saying, well, look at it this way. And then people go, oh, well, that's interesting. There is definitely.
Yeah, so I don't know, maybe just take those comments on board and see what makes sense. But
if we're innovating in a way that the industry takes on because we're doing something that people should be doing, that's great. We want to be leaders as we have said as our vision statement. But I think before we go and present on it, we ought to run it by some people who can give us an unbiased, look at our approach so that we make sure that this is what you do with any any scientific publication. You get it peer reviewed so that you have that benefit of other opinions from other experts. So
absolutely, to a degree, Monty, just to a small degree, I feel like we're also peer reviewers on this one. Like you may not agree, but I do feel like that it's hard to identify the flaws when you really dig into the methods that Brett and but I'm only one. There's usually three, right? Four. Anyway, let's move on to public comments then.
Yes, there are a few. We have first Phil Sauter, then Jack, and then we have Ed Jamison.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I too was a little bug-eyed by the cost of conservation, and I think next steps of getting more people talking about it is good. The other number that seemed a little bit strange to me was the potential for 150 acre feet for conservation, which seems low. That's 150,000 gallons per day, which is about 1% of our daily use. And since we use 60% of our residential water outdoors, it seems like there's be some more upward room there. Second, a few months ago, I suggested that we test our various supply option for PFAS before we spend a lot more money and time evaluating them. I'm not sure if we've done that testing or not, but now that we're back to discussing desal and recycled water as potential sources of drinking water, I'd like to renew that suggestion that we test these sources. Personally, for the last 50 years, I've been reminded how lucky we are in Marin to have our own pristine watershed, free of the industrial and sewage-related compounds that many other water districts have to remove from their lower quality water supplies. I've never had to pick up the paper or read a government report that includes Marin County in the list of water districts that are at risk for sending PFAS into customers' homes. If it's going to be used for potable water, I think Marin water customers have the right to question our water supply being potentially contaminated with these chemicals from outside our watershed. It would be simple and cheap to test these potential water sources for PFAS right now and avoid spending more time and money going down a path that may be a dead end. If we're going to run into problems, I think it would be better to know about them now. And finally, on the issue of value, I've really tried to follow this, and I'm working on it. I haven't got it yet, but I'd never bet against Paul or Brett. So I'm still going to work on it. It's easier for me, I think, to think in terms of insurance. You know, I'd much rather pay my insurance bill right before I have an accident, but so far nobody's given me that deal. I will say that when I look at the reservoir levels anytime between April and September, like this morning, I feel more secure seeing, 75 to 90% than I do seeing 50%. And I'd never fault the water district for buying more Sonoma water right now to up those levels and keep us a little bit safer. Thank you.
Thank you. Jack?
I did want to speak because I do want the public to understand where this district is in regards to PFAS. We have checked our current sources and we do not have a PFAS issue. Generally, groundwater is where you see it in a predominant way. Were we, as we look at water supplies, I think DPR would be interesting if we were headed there. We'd want to think about it a little bit. Of course, with the treatment technologies, I think you could address it. But yeah, I don't think with the options we're looking at, additional water from Sonoma, storing more rainwater, we're fortunate that PFAS is really not a dynamic for us that we have to be concerned with, unlike so many people in the water business.
To that end, we might also think about looking in a closet because Gore-Tex and those types of materials all have these chemicals. And each of us in our blood supply, at least according to the recent articles that have been flying around about 3M, are carrying a fair burden of PFAS already. So anything waterproof, anything that's waterproof has got those compounds, and fire equipment.
There were a couple things I wanted to mention. First, it may be worth noting that in theory, from an environmental perspective, it's worth that converting a water right from agricultural water use to residential water use by buying out agricultural water rights from places such as the Russian River or Central Valley should probably be considered a better environmental option than directly extracting water from nature by, for example, raising dams. If we raise Solahuli or whatever other dam in Marin, we are directly extracting water away from the fish and nature versus buying out some water right of an alfalfa farm in the Central Valley or just whatever farm in Sonoma County is converting agricultural water into residential water and it's ultimately not extracting water from nature. And therefore, even though it's still using fresh water that could in theory be part of nature, nonetheless, the total human water use in California is not fundamentally changing if you convert how the water is used. And the second comment I wanted to make is I recall in the past there was discussion about getting water from Yuba City and putting a pipe across the Richmond Bridge. And I am very curious as to why that's gone out of the picture, especially after factoring in that water from the Russian River appears to be less expensive than raising dams or desal plants. So I'm just curious about that.
Thank you. Ed Jamison, then Larry Minikis, and Eric's iPad. Go ahead, Mr.
Yes, thanks. As usual, this was another really outstanding presentation of a complex subject. I'd just like to express appreciation of the district's thoughtful new approach to costing incremental water supplies, recognizing that sources that can be turned on in drought have a higher value than sources that are almost always spilled and that have zero value for MMWD in almost all years. That next to last slide was a really masterful summary of lots of complicating factors. Well done. Finally, most industry standard costing approaches assume that water is valuable and will be used every year as a normal source of water. But with Marin's almost unique drought risk, we absolutely need a different analytical approach to look at the cost of marginal water supplies that are valuable only in drought. And that's what we saw tonight. This new methodology is absolutely the right approach for Marin's unusual drought vulnerability. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Minikis?
Yes, good evening. And I also like to thank staff for the presentation tonight. And I'm sorry I couldn't be there as I had to also attend the MCL meeting as we were discussing our own water policy this evening, which I had to present. I think we knew going into this that doing desal alone in Marin was not going to be a viable option. It was going to be too expensive, and that we're still waiting to understand whether there's any viability to doing a desal plant along with Sonoma Water along the Petaluma River. And I think seeing that, I'm not advocating one way or the other, but it will be an interesting comparison to doing desal here alone, if it's even viable. Thank you.
Thank you. Eric's iPad?
Oh, this is Eric Groves. I was going to reiterate the view that the proper way to cost this situation is to think about it as insurance. You're buying insurance to have the capacity to address a drought of 4 years every so often. And that's the proper way to think about these insurance. This is the way FEMA thinks about whether or not they're going to have the equipment to deal with a hurricane, whether various people worry about the great annual flood, various apocalypses. You had your insurance person come by and talk about the number of $1 billion events over time, and it seems to be shrinking in terms of the frequencies increasing and the interval between $1 billion events is decreasing. So this is an insurance problem, and I think there's a very long history of underwriting skills for how to do this. So I don't think you need to worry about defending them. You may need to marshal somebody to stand behind you and raise their hand to say, this is the right thing to be doing, but you are doing the right thing. And I would like to continue to encourage this. Thank you.
Thank you. There are no further speakers.
Thanks again for the insightful public input. Always appreciated. And with that, we'll move to the last agenda item, which is our future board and committee meetings and upcoming agenda items. I'll just remind board members that this is the time if we want to request items to be added to upcoming meetings. Any requests today? Okay, then Terry, maybe just the list of what's coming up.
Yeah, so the next 2 days, Thursday and Friday, not including tomorrow because it's a holiday and we're honoring Juneteenth. But Thursday is the Watershed Committee meeting / special meeting of the Board of Directors, and Friday is the Operations Committee meeting / special meeting of the Board of Directors. Next week, we'll have our Finance and Administration Committee meeting. Oh, and then external meetings, not until July, which is the NBWA meeting.
Thank you, Terry. And with that, our Marin Water Board of Directors meeting of June 18th, 2024 is adjourned.